You ever feel like life is tapping you on the shoulder, whispering something urgent you can't quite hear? Like there's this persistent pull towards something bigger, something you're supposed to become. But every time you get close to understanding what it is, the noise of daily survival drowns it out. You feel restless in spaces that used to feel safe. Conversations that once satisfied you now feel hollow. Success that should make you proud leaves you empty, wondering if this is really all there is. You find yourself staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m, your chest tight with a nameless frustration, feeling like you're living someone else's version of your life while your own soul is locked in a room somewhere, banging on the door to get out. That restlessness isn't random. It's not a flaw in your character or a sign that something is wrong with you. It's not ingratitude for what you have or some millennial crisis that therapy and a vacation can fix. What you're experiencing is something Abraham Maslow spent his entire career documenting, something he discovered in his most groundbreaking work on human potential. You're being called. The universe, life, whatever you want to name that force that pushes seeds through concrete and salmon upstream, is sending you signals that your current level of existence is no longer enough. You've outgrown it. And what's terrifying is that most people spend their entire lives ignoring these signals, building increasingly elaborate structures to silence them, medicating them with entertainment and achievement and busyness, never realizing that the discomfort they're running from is actually the birth pang of their truest self trying to emerge. Maslow discovered something that changed psychology forever. He found that human beings aren't just motivated by deficiency and survival. We're pulled forward by growth. There's a built-in urge toward what he called self-actualization, toward becoming everything we're capable of becoming. But here's what makes his research so unsettling and so profound. This urge doesn't announce itself with clarity and certainty. It arrives as disruption, as dissatisfaction with what used to work, as a series of uncomfortable experiences that feel like the universe is dismantling your life, when actually it's trying to rebuild you at a higher level of consciousness and capability. Maslow documented 7 specific patterns that appear when someone is being called toward their actualization. 7 signs that show up in your emotional life, your relationships, your work, your inner world, telling you that staying where you are is no longer an option. These aren't mystical or abstract. They're psychological realities that thousands of his research subjects experienced, and today, you're going to recognize yourself in them. What I'm about to share with you isn't about manifesting abundance or finding your purpose through positive thinking. It's about understanding the actual developmental stages of human consciousness that Maslow mapped through decades of clinical observation. It's about recognizing that the discomfort you feel right now, the sense that something is wrong even when everything looks right on paper, is actually evidence that something is profoundly correct. Your psyche is functioning exactly as it should. The question is whether you'll listen to what it's trying to tell you, or whether you'll spend the next decade of your life building a more comfortable prison, wondering why the restlessness never goes away no matter how much you achieve or acquire or accomplish. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which stage you're in, what the universe is trying to wake you up to, and what happens next if you answer the call or if you don't. The discovery Maslow made that shook the entire field of psychology wasn't about pathology or dysfunction. It was about health. Every other psychologist of his era was studying sick people, trying to understand what makes humans broken. Maslow had a revolutionary idea. What if we studied the healthiest people we can find and discovered what makes humans whole? So he spent years researching people he called self-actualizers, individuals who had reached the highest levels of psychological development and human functioning. What he found in these individuals wasn't just success or happiness. It was a completely different way of experiencing reality itself. And one of the most consistent patterns he documented was this. Every single one of them had gone through periods of profound disruption before their actualization. Periods where the universe seemed to be systematically dismantling everything they thought they knew about who they were and what they wanted. They didn't experience these periods as blessings. They experienced them as crises. But looking back, they could see that those crises were actually invitations. The first sign that the universe is trying to awaken you is what Maslow called divine dissatisfaction. You start feeling deeply unsatisfied with things that used to fulfill you. Your job that pays well and gives you status suddenly feels meaningless. Relationships that were comfortable now feel suffocating. Hobbies and distractions that used to soothe you don't work anymore. You're not depressed in the clinical sense. You can still function. But there's this constant background hum of wrongness, like you're living in a house that's 2 sizes too small and every movement reminds you that you don't fit. What most people don't understand is that this dissatisfaction isn't a problem to solve. It's a developmental signal. Maslow found that when people satisfy the needs of one level of his hierarchy, the needs of the next level emerge. If you've handled your safety, your belonging, your esteem, your psyche automatically begins reaching toward actualization. The dissatisfaction you feel is your consciousness outgrowing its current container. The universe is telling you that the life you built for the person you used to be no longer fits the person you're becoming. Maslow documented a specific case that perfectly illustrates this pattern. A successful businessman in his 40s. Everything society tells you represents achievement. Good income, respected position, stable family, nice home. But he came to Maslow in quiet desperation because he felt like he was suffocating. He described it as living behind glass, watching his own life happen to someone else. Every morning he woke up with a sense of dread that he couldn't name. Every accomplishment felt hollow seconds after achieving it. He thought something was wrong with him. Why couldn't he just be grateful? Why couldn't success be enough? What Maslow helped him see was that nothing was wrong. Something was right. His psyche had satisfied the lower needs, security and status and belonging, and was now demanding the higher ones, meaning and authenticity and purpose. The dissatisfaction wasn't a malfunction. It was an upgrade trying to install itself. The universe was tapping him on the shoulder saying your real work is waiting, and this comfortable life you built is keeping you from it. The second sign is that you become hypersensitive to inauthenticity. You can smell fakeness from a mile away. In others, but especially in yourself, conversations that require you to perform or pretend feel physically exhausting. Work environments that demand you hide parts of yourself to fit in become intolerable. You start having this visceral reaction to your own compromises, the little ways you edit yourself to be acceptable, the truths you swallow to keep the peace, the dreams you don't mention because they'd make you sound crazy. It feels like your tolerance for your own self-betrayal has dropped to zero. Maslow found this pattern consistently in people approaching actualization. As you climb the hierarchy, authenticity stops being optional and starts being essential. Your psyche begins refusing to cooperate with situations that require you to be less than fully yourself. This isn't about being difficult or entitled. It's about psychological integrity. The universe is trying to show you that the energy required to maintain a false self is energy you need for your actual development. Every hour you spend pretending is an hour stolen from becoming. One of Maslow's research subjects described this stage with brutal honesty. She said it felt like she'd been wearing a costume her whole life, playing the role everyone expected, good daughter, good wife, good employee, and suddenly the costume didn't fit anymore. Not because it was too small, but because she couldn't remember why she was wearing it in the first place. She would sit in meetings nodding along to conversations that meant nothing, smiling through family dinners that felt like performance art, and she could feel something inside her screaming. Not in anger, but in urgency. Like a part of her that had been dormant was waking up and demanding to be lived. What she initially interpreted as a breakdown was actually what Maslow called a breakthrough. Her authentic self was becoming too powerful to suppress. The universe was forcing a choice. Keep pretending and fragment, or risk being real and integrate. Look, if you felt any of this so far, that sense that something is calling you forward even though you can't see where, that restlessness with things that should be enough, that allergic reaction to your own compromises, I want to ask you something. When was the last time you admitted out loud that you feel stuck between who you've been and who you're supposed to become? That you're carrying this weight of unfulfilled potential that nobody around you seems to see or understand? If that hits home, do something with me right now. Leave a comment. Just this. I'm ready to hear what the universe is saying. That's it. I'm ready to hear what the universe is saying. Because here's what happens when you name what's happening instead of just enduring it. You stop feeling alone in it. Someone else reading your comment will feel less crazy. You'll feel less crazy. And something about declaring your readiness, even in a YouTube comment section, shifts something internally. You move from passive suffering to active seeking. So if this resonates, if you're tired of ignoring the tap on your shoulder, leave that comment. I'm ready to hear what the universe is saying. Your willingness to admit where you are is the first real step toward where you're going. And honestly, your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone in their own awakening. The third sign Maslow identified is what he called increasing solitude. Not loneliness, but a growing need to be alone with your own thoughts and your own becoming. You start craving space from the noise. Social obligations that used to energize you now drain you. Small talk feels like sandpaper on your soul. You find yourself pulling back from relationships that don't leave room for depth, from environments that demand constant performance, from the collective trance of busyness and distraction. People around you might think you're withdrawing or depressed. What's actually happening is that you're being pulled inward for reconstruction. Maslow found that self-actualizing people go through extended periods of what he called aloneness, where they need to separate from the tribe's expectations to discover their own truth. The universe is creating space in your life for you to hear your own voice clearly, maybe for the first time. It's removing the scaffolding of other people's opinions so you can see what you actually want when nobody's watching. Maslow studied a young woman who described this phase as feeling like she was living in two worlds simultaneously. In one world, she showed up for work, answered emails, met friends for dinner, maintained the appearance of normal life. In the other world, the one that felt increasingly more real, she was having this constant internal conversation with herself about meaning and purpose, and who she actually was beneath all the roles. She would sit alone in her apartment at night, not watching TV or scrolling, just sitting, and feel more alive than she did in a room full of people. Her friends thought she was isolating. Her family worried she was lonely, but she wasn't lonely. She was finally meeting herself. The universe had turned down the external volume so she could hear the internal signal, and what she heard was a voice that had been trying to speak her entire life but never had the space to be heard. The fourth sign is the emergence of peak experiences. Maslow coined this term to describe moments of profound transcendence, where you suddenly experience reality at a completely different level of intensity and clarity. These aren't drug-induced or religious in the traditional sense, though they can feel spiritual. They're spontaneous moments where the ordinary becomes extraordinary. You're looking at a sunset and suddenly you're not separate from it. You're part of something infinite. You're listening to music and it's not just sound, it's the structure of the universe revealing itself. You're holding your child, and for a split second you understand what love actually is. Not the greeting card version, but the force that holds existence together. These experiences are brief, usually seconds or minutes, but they permanently alter your baseline. You can't unsee what you saw. You can't go back to believing that surface-level reality is all there is. Maslow found that as people approach self-actualization, peak experiences become more frequent. The universe is giving you glimpses of what's possible, showing you the level of consciousness you're being invited into, proving that transcendence isn't theoretical, it's available. One of the most powerful cases Maslow documented involved a scientist who had spent his entire career in rigid rationalism, believing that reality was purely material and measurable. Then one afternoon, sitting in his backyard doing nothing in particular, he had what he could only describe as an experience of unity. For about 90 seconds, the boundaries between himself and the trees and the sky dissolved. He felt connected to everything, not metaphorically, but as direct experience. When it passed, he was shaken. His entire worldview couldn't account for what had just happened. He couldn't explain it with the framework he'd used his whole life. That experience cracked something open in him. He began questioning everything he'd assumed about the nature of consciousness and reality. The universe had given him a preview of a higher state, and now the life he'd been living felt like sleepwalking by comparison. He couldn't go backward. He had to figure out how to integrate what he'd experienced, which meant his entire life had to reorganize around a new understanding of what was real and what mattered. The fifth sign is the death of your old identity. This is the hardest one because it feels like loss. You start realizing that the person you've been with their goals and fears and strategies isn't who you're becoming. The dreams that used to excite you don't anymore. The fears that used to control you lose their power. The ways you used to get validation stop working. It's disorienting because you're losing yourself without yet knowing who's emerging. Maslow called this the identity crisis of actualization. You're shedding a skin, but you're still soft and vulnerable underneath, not yet formed into the new shape. During this phase, people often feel like they're going crazy. They don't recognize themselves. They make choices that shock people who thought they knew them. They leave jobs, relationships, cities, not out of impulse but out of necessity, because staying in structures built for the old self would kill the new one. The universe is destroying who you were, so you can become who you are. It's not gentle, but it's necessary. Maslow worked with a woman in her 50s who had spent 3 decades building a life around being needed. She was the dependable one, the caretaker, the person everyone called when they needed something. Her entire identity was constructed around external validation through service. Then something shifted. She started feeling resentment where she used to feel purpose. She started saying no where she used to automatically say yes. People were confused, some were angry. Who was this person setting boundaries? What happened to the woman who always put others first? She felt guilty at first, like she was betraying everyone. But underneath the guilt was something stronger. A voice saying you've spent 50 years living for everyone else's needs, and you're going to die without ever discovering your own. The universe was forcing her to grieve the loss of her people-pleasing self so a more authentic self could emerge. It was excruciating. But on the other side was a life that actually belonged to her. The 6th sign Maslow identified is the call to create or contribute something meaningful. This isn't about career ambition or making money or getting famous. It's a deep cellular urge to bring something into existence that didn't exist before, to contribute something to the world that only you can contribute because of your specific combination of gifts and wounds and experiences. You feel pregnant with something, an idea, a project, a way of serving, and not bringing it into form feels like suffocation. Maslow found that self-actualizing people are almost always engaged in some mission or creative work that's bigger than personal benefit. They've moved from deficiency motivation, doing things to fill holes in themselves, to being motivation, doing things because it's an expression of who they are. The universe is trying to awaken you to your unique contribution, the thing you're here to do that will die with you if you don't do it. This urge can't be ignored indefinitely without serious psychological cost. One of Maslow's subjects was a teacher who had been competent and reliable for 20 years, doing the job well enough to keep everyone satisfied, but never particularly inspired by it. Then she started noticing something. She would be in the middle of a lesson plan and suddenly see a completely different way to reach kids who were struggling, a method that had nothing to do with the curriculum, but everything to do with understanding how young minds actually work. She began experimenting, staying late to develop new approaches, feeling more alive than she had in years. What she was experiencing wasn't about teaching anymore. It was about a larger vision of how education could transform if it was designed around human development instead of standardization. She didn't know what to do with this vision. It was too big. It would require leaving the safety of her classroom and taking risks she'd never taken. But the vision wouldn't let her go. She felt haunted by what could exist if she had the courage to build it. The universe was showing her that her real work wasn't teaching within a system. It was changing the system itself. And ignoring that call was making her sick with unexpressed potential. The 7th and final sign is what Maslow called the courage to face your own greatness. This might sound strange because we usually think about fear of failure, not fear of success or power. But Maslow found that one of the biggest barriers to self-actualization is what he named the Jonah complex, the fear of our own possibilities. When you start to realize what you're actually capable of, when you glimpse the life you could live if you fully committed to your potential, it's terrifying. Because that life would require you to take responsibility at a level you've never taken before. It would require you to stop hiding behind excuses and limitations. It would require you to own your power and your choices completely. Most people, Maslow found, prefer to stay small because smallness is safe. It gives you reasons for why things don't work out. It lets you blame circumstances or other people. But the universe, when it's trying to awaken you, removes those hiding places. It puts you in situations where your own capability is undeniable, where you can't pretend anymore that you're not powerful enough, or smart enough, or brave enough. And then the choice becomes clear. Step into your greatness or spend the rest of your life managing the regret of not stepping into it. Maslow interviewed a man who had entrepreneurial ideas for years, but always found reasons not to pursue them. Not enough capital, not the right time, too risky with a family. Then he lost his job. The safe path disappeared, and suddenly he was faced with the reality that he could actually build what he'd been imagining, or he could get another safe job and wonder forever what might have been. What struck Maslow about this case was the man's honesty about his fear. He said the scariest part wasn't that the business might fail, it was that it might succeed. Because if it succeeded, he couldn't pretend anymore that circumstances were holding him back. He would have to admit that he'd been holding himself back all along. He would have to live at a level of intensity and responsibility and visibility that part of him desperately wanted, and another part of him was terrified of. The universe had removed his excuses. Now he had to choose. So let's come back to where we started, to that restless feeling you couldn't name, that tap on your shoulder you've been trying to ignore. What Maslow discovered through decades of research is that this discomfort isn't random and it isn't a flaw. It's developmental. It's your psyche doing exactly what healthy psyches do when they've satisfied one level of needs, reaching toward the next. The 7 signs: divine dissatisfaction with what used to work, hypersensitivity to inauthenticity in yourself and others, increasing need for solitude to hear your own voice, emergence of peak experiences that show you what's possible, death of your old identity, call to create something meaningful, and the courage to face your own greatness. These aren't separate problems to fix. They're one unified process, the universe trying to wake you up to who you actually are underneath all the conditioning and compromise and fear. That businessman who felt like he was living behind glass? Maslow helped him see that his comfortable life wasn't the destination. It was base camp. He'd climbed to safety and belonging and respect, and now the real mountain was visible, the mountain of meaning and authenticity and self-actualization. He had a choice. Stay at base camp where it's comfortable but slowly suffocating, or start climbing toward the summit where the air is thin and the path is uncertain, but you're fully alive. He chose to climb. He didn't blow up his life dramatically, but he started making different choices. He took on projects at work that mattered to him even if they didn't advance his status. He had honest conversations with his wife about who he was becoming. He gave himself permission to not know all the answers, but to trust the questions. 2 years later, Maslow checked in with him. He said the restlessness hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed from anxiety into energy, from a signal that something was wrong into a signal that something was emerging. That young woman who became allergic to her own pretending, she didn't have a map for what came next. She just started experimenting with radical honesty, first in low-stakes situations, then in higher-stakes ones. She told people what she actually thought instead of what they wanted to hear. She pursued interests that didn't make sense to anyone else. She let some relationships end that were built on the false version of her. It was lonely at first, but slowly, she started attracting different people. People who wanted depth, people who valued authenticity, people who were on their own journeys of awakening. She found her tribe not by looking for them, but by becoming herself so fully that they recognized her. That woman in her 50s who had to grieve her people-pleasing identity. The transition was brutal. She lost friends who only wanted the version of her that served them. Her family went through an adjustment period where they had to learn she wasn't endlessly available anymore. But she discovered something on the other side of that grief. She found out who she was when she wasn't performing for validation. She started painting. Something she'd loved as a young woman but abandoned because it wasn't productive or useful to others. She wasn't good at it yet. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she was doing something purely because it made her feel alive. And that small act of self-honoring was revolutionary for someone who'd spent 5 decades living for external approval. The universe had torn down her false structure, so a true one could be built. Here's what Maslow understood that most of psychology missed. Self-actualization isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a direction you move in. It's a process of becoming more fully yourself, more authentic, more courageous, more connected to what matters, more alive to your own experience. The 7 signs aren't things to get past so you can finally relax. They're invitations into a different quality of life. A life where you're not just surviving or even succeeding by conventional metrics, but actually expressing the unique possibility that you are. And the invitation doesn't come once. It comes repeatedly at different levels, calling you higher each time. But, and this is crucial, the invitation can be declined. You can feel the tap on your shoulder and turn away. You can feel the divine dissatisfaction and medicate it with achievement or consumption or distraction. You can feel the call to authenticity and choose safety instead. You can feel the death of your old identity and cling to it desperately even as it suffocates you. You can feel the urge to create something meaningful and tell yourself you're not ready, not qualified, not brave enough. Maslow saw both outcomes. He saw people who answered the call and underwent profound transformation. And he saw people who spent decades running from their own potential, building increasingly elaborate defenses against their own greatness, and dying with their gifts still locked inside them. The tragedy wasn't that they failed. It was that they never tried. They lived their entire lives in base camp, convincing themselves it was the summit, never knowing what they were capable of because they were too afraid to find out. So the question isn't whether the universe is trying to awaken you. If you're feeling the restlessness, the dissatisfaction, the pull toward something bigger, it already is. The question is whether you're going to listen, whether you're going to trust that the discomfort is directional, pointing you toward your next level of development, whether you're going to risk the known and comfortable for the unknown and authentic, whether you're going to become who you're capable of becoming, or spend your life managing the quiet grief of not becoming. And here's what I want you to understand. You being here right now watching this video, resonating with what Maslow discovered, feeling seen in these patterns, that's not random either. You're in a conversation with thousands of other people who are being called in the same direction, who are feeling the same restlessness, who are tired of living smaller than they actually are. This journey toward actualization, toward becoming fully yourself, it's not something you have to do alone. It's actually easier when you're surrounded by people who understand the language, who won't think you're crazy for wanting more than comfort, who will remind you why you started when it gets hard. If what you heard today landed, if you found yourself thinking, yes, that's what I've been feeling, I don't want to just leave you with information. I want to invite you to continue this conversation. This channel exists to explore these questions, to dive deep into human potential and consciousness and the journey of becoming, to translate psychology and philosophy and lived experience into something practical and real. We put out new videos regularly that go even deeper into these territories. Next week, we're exploring what Maslow called deficiency love versus being love, and why most of what we call love is actually neediness in disguise, and how that realization changes everything about how we connect. The week after, we're looking at Maslow's research on self-actualizing people and the specific daily practices they use to maintain their development. If you want to be part of this community, if you want reminders that you're not alone in this process, if you want to keep discovering what's possible when you stop settling for what's safe, just click subscribe. That's your signal to yourself and to the universe that you're committed to this path, that you're choosing growth over comfort, that you're answering the call, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next insight that might be exactly what you need to hear at exactly the right moment. You've made it this far, which means something in you is ready to keep going. Remember that businessman at base camp deciding whether to climb? That teacher haunted by a vision bigger than her classroom? That woman finally meeting herself in the silence? They're not special. They're just people who stopped ignoring the tap on their shoulder and started listening to what the universe was trying to tell them. You can do the same thing. Starting right now. The restlessness you feel isn't a curse. It's a compass, and it's pointing you toward everything you're meant to become.